Scouting was that stabilizing influence throughout junior high and high school. And I realized that you didn't have to be dogmatic to be a good person.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 33, part 1. My guest today was a lot of fun to talk to. We initially corresponded via email, and a couple things I learned about him were, like myself, he earned a bachelor's degree in biblical studies, and the funny thing is that he grew up pretty much in the same town that I grew up in. The Salvation Army church that he attended was literally within walking distance from my childhood home. It was fun to hear him talk about some of the cities that he lived in and the different churches he attended, some of which I actually attended myself when I was growing up. In today's episode, he shares his story and how, when he was young, his parents' divorce pretty much left him as the mediator between his mom and his dad, and he talks about how difficult that was. Something that became a very stabilizing force in his life was Boy Scouts. As I mentioned earlier, he earned a bachelor's degree in biblical studies, and then he and his wife served as officers or ministers in the Salvation Army for 12 plus years in a variety of different roles. He now considers himself a humanist, and his family attends a Unitarian church. It's been great getting to know him. The conversation was a lot of fun. Here's my interview with Bill Finley. Okay, well, Bill, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's always good to share a story, and your podcast has been helpful and over the last while since I found it, so more than happy to share my story.
Cool, yeah. That's awesome. You said that you call yourself a humanist, so why do you prefer to use that term?
So I use the term humanist mostly from the sense of I would prefer to be known for what I want to do. So even in the tail end of my Christian walk and my faith, it was really an action-oriented belief system. And the problem with saying atheist or agnostic is really about belief. And humanism, well, those are inherently part of a humanist faith tradition. It is much more about active actions and how you treat people. The word the phrase that's used in the UU circles is religious humanism.
Interesting.
And there's some value there that I found as we've explored that for the last year or so. So for me, it's this sense of really life is about how we treat other people in this world, because this is all there is. So
yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about your kind of how Christianity influenced your childhood.
Yeah. So I didn't know a Sunday not going to church, except for in between when my parents were divorced or when my mom was divorcing my stepdad. I grew up in Seattle, south end of Seattle, specifically Federway, Des Moines, Normandy Park area, what's now commonly known as SeaTac for a while. And growing up, church was what everything revolved around. So some of my earliest memories were going to church. The church we attended always charismatic or Pentecostal churches with a couple exceptions. The church I remember the most is called CBSR, Church by the Side of the Road. For you and others.
I think I've been there, actually.
Yeah, you probably have. I think it's still sitting up on Pacific Coast Highway at about 160th. Spent a lot of time there when I was young. For a while, when I was in kindergarten, first grade, my dad was he's always had this dream of being a minister. And he was a youth pastor at a Assembly of God church in Des Moines. I think it was called Des Moines Assembly for a while. And that ended when my mom left him. And church was so much a part of our lives that the night that my mom had planned to leave my dad, and she'd planned this for couple months, it seems like. He went to church in the beater car. They had 2 cars. One was at that time, 10-year-old or more than that, Chevy Impala. And the other one was this green Ford something that blew tons of smoke out the exhaust. He went to evening church like he always did, and they had a fight because my mom didn't want to take us. And unbeknownst to him, when he came back, we were gone.
Whoa. So she took the kids with her.
Yeah.
How old were you when that happened?
Going into 2nd grade.
Wow. So that's really a formative time.
Yeah. This was... So time period, we're talking 80, I think it was 85 when they split. And then we actually lived with a family who was friends of a family that we were family friends with for about a year, little over a year, almost a year and a half, in their attic. They had converted their attic into 2 bedrooms. We had 4 single beds, and that's where we lived for a year and a half, essentially by definition homeless.
And did you know that she was going to pack all the stuff up and have you guys leave?
No, we didn't.
Wow. So it was just like all of a sudden it just happened.
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways my mom was afraid that if she didn't do it secretly, I don't know what she was afraid of, but she was afraid that she wouldn't do it. And there was a lot of reasons. Knowing what I know about my dad and mom now, I get it. I completely get it. Most of it was financial. Like I said, my dad always had this dream of being a minister. And what that meant was he usually drove cab and did church on the side. And that wasn't what she wanted. So she actually went back to school and got into computers. And so since 87, she's been a top flight database programmer up in that area. So, we went really quick from being homeless, food stamps, more than one occasion. I remember going to the food pantry to get government cheese. And then, 10 years later, she's able to pay for my college.
Wow.
So it was a really, from an economic standpoint, really transformative and interesting process to watch. From an emotional and religious standpoint, it was jacked.
Oh man, yeah.
So, what the side effect of what she did was, from the time I was in the 3rd grade, I was a latchkey kid. We lived in Normandy Park. We lived at some apartments. Religiously, after my parents split, we went back to church by the side of the road for a couple years. We tried, they tried counseling and all that. A year and a half later, the divorce was finalized. And I don't know all the issues involved, but, my dad had been, Sunday school superintendent and, was involved in the youth group and other things like that. And so, when all that happened, my mom didn't feel accepted, might have been the word.
Yeah.
So he stopped going as well, but there was a stigma attached with divorce. especially in that world where it wasn't as male dominated as some other church sects, but I think there was still this definite thing. I mean, my mom is very introverted. My dad is very extroverted. I have an image in my head of while they were separated on a Sunday, my dad was singing in the choir and seeing him after service. There aren't a ton of images in my head from that time period because, quite frankly, it sucked.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot of images or memories. This Pentecostal Jesus thing was there that entire time. So even while the family's deconstructing, there is still an overwhelming sense of, well, God's in control. God will take care of it all. Having a faith. So, and my mom struggled with that because that was the message the pastor was telling her. Just stay with him. He's good. It'll all take care of itself.
Yeah.
My mom's like, but I have bills to pay.
Yeah, and she wants something different for her life.
Right.
And sometimes you find that out years later, you know?
Yeah. So,
Wow.
and there was a lot of that. And I don't know, neither of them have ever gone deep with talking about that whole time. So most of my memories growing up were not them together. It is separate,
But what's interesting is they were still going, well, you were still going to the same church.
Yeah.
So he's in the choir. Would she actually attend the services that he was a part of? Wow. Yeah, that's really gutsy that she or brave, I guess, courageous or something, to be in the same area like that with someone who you would literally just like left in an instant,
Yeah, it's really weird because I don't have, and we'll get into this a little bit, but suffice to say, my memories of them together are fighting. So up until the last time they saw each other, second to last time, which is when I got married, but prior to that, when I was commissioned and ordained in the Salvation Army, they saw each other and they were near each other for more than 2 days, which always ends up in a fight.
Oh, wow.
So,
how long? Yeah. How long how much time went by from the time that she kept going? Like she divorced him, and then how much time in the church until she was like, I can't be in the same room?
I don't know the answer to that question. I've not been able to piece it together in my head. It's somewhere between 1 year and 2 years.
Okay. That's considerable. Yeah.
I do remember a time period, and I think it was before 4th grade. So I think it was a couple years of this nebulousness. But I believe it was before 4th grade when we spent a summer church shopping. That she had made a decision not to go back there, and we were going to spend some time church shopping. So in that process, for those couple of years, I think we were at church by the side of the road. However, my dad stopped going at some point. And that might have been 6 months, a year. I don't know when it was. But he, for a while, just gave up on church, basically said, screw it, I'm out. And for somebody who spent their entire life in the church and wanted to be a minister, and that was hard on him for a while. It lasted a couple years. He got remarried during that time. He got remarried in January of 86 or 87.
Okay, so
shortly after the divorce was finalized, and then after a while, he started getting back involved in the church. And
so he never walked away from his faith. He just took a break from like organized religion.
Yeah, he would call it he backslid, using a good Wesleyan terminology. But I don't know. In his heart of hearts, in his belief structure, I have no idea what he was thinking. It was a pretty major bout with depression.
Oh wow, yeah.
So, your dream and your world is upside down. So
yeah, I know what that feels like. Well, at least the upside down piece, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what was you mentioned that it was just like a really difficult time. What do you think was the most difficult about all of that for you?
I think for me, it started really early, and it never ended really until I got out of high school. And that was, I was the one in the middle. I'm the oldest. My sister's 2 years younger. And there was always, it felt like, and in some ways it was, that all the communication that had to happen between my mom and dad went through me.
Wow.
And for a variety of reasons, they couldn't talk to each other without screaming and yelling and hanging up the phone on each other. And in some ways, I was the planner. I was the one who said, okay, these are the days. I had to know my schedule. It ended up, by junior high school, it was definitely that way. But even earlier, there was still a lot of that.
Wow.
I think, looking back, the best thing that happened for me actually was when we were doing this church shopping before 4th grade. We ended up deciding to attend the church that was right next door to our apartment complex, just John Knox Presbyterian.
Oh man, I know so many people that went there. It's so weird that we grew up in such a similar area. I mean, like tons of people that went to high school with me went to that church anyway. Yeah, that's awesome.
They probably were in my scout troop, some of them.
Yeah.
So We started attending there when I was in the fourth grade. Before sixth grade, we moved. My mom was able to buy a house in the north end of Federal Way off of 288th. But we still went there for a little bit. During this time period, she meets a guy who she had dated before after my parents split up. And he wanted a Pentecostal church. And so we had some other family friends who had been friends of my mom's and dad's years before that attended Assembly of God Church in Northeast Tacoma. I tried to find it. I couldn't.
Oh, yeah.
But, so we attended there for, I want to say 2.5 years. I know 7th and 8th grade, maybe some of 6th grade. But my mom and stepdad were married about 1.5 years, and then my mom got divorced from him. And so that stopped that church.
But it was John Knox's church that you were going to for a couple of years there with your mom? Yeah. And your dad was going to a Pentecostal church then?
At that time, no. He had transitioned, and he was starting to get back involved with the Salvation Army. So this is where my life with the Salvation Army starts kind of beginning.
Okay.
We would spend every other weekend with my dad while he was living in Seattle. And during that time, he felt this, okay, well, I'll get back in touch with the church of my youth. And he was raised in the Salvation Army as his church. His dad had been an alcoholic and got saved on Skid Row. And raised them as that was their church. And so my dad started getting back involved when I was in the 5th grade and then the 6th grade. And then after my 6th grade year, my dad moved to Idaho.
Wow.
So he relocated to Twin Falls, Idaho because he had a job. He had a promise of a job, sort of.
Okay.
I think he was working in the thrift store for the Salvation Army for a little bit.
And he clearly needed a change. He needed something different.
Yeah, he did. The interesting thing about that is about 6 months after he moves, the entire church, which, looking back on it, had been infiltrated by a very cultish personality and very Pentecostal, which is not the norm for the Salvation Army, left. So he left with the church of 100 people, and the Salvation Army officer basically took the congregation and formed a new church.
Wow.
And within about a year, a different person who had been part of that took over the church. And so for about the next 4 years, my dad was an assistant minister, sort of, for a Pentecostal church that was a full-fledged cult. They were doing arranged marriages. All the craziness that you can come out with. The real issue for me was the arranged marriages and the prophecies and all the other shit. There's just a lot of control that went on there.
That's crazy.
We'd pop in for the summer and spend 4 weeks in this stuff. And the Pentecostal stuff wasn't foreign to me. I mean, I grew up with all this. And some of this stuff is just like, this is seriously fucked up. And so the environment when I was home was this, run-of-the-mill Assembly of God church where they pray over you till you speak in tongues because you got to fake it to make it. It was a weekend thing at the church for junior hires, and they said, you don't speak in tongues, so they lay your hands on you and pray over you in these weird things, and so you learn how to fake it.
Yeah.
So my dad was involved in that I was in 7th grade up until 10th grade. I think he got out of it. So, 5 years or so, and just this really whacked thing. What that did was, by being exposed to all these different variations of Christianity, it made me question all the churches.
Oh.
So, I had attended, the Salvation Army, which is a Wesleyan holiness church, to Pentecostal, to Presbyterian, to, in high school, a friend of mine, my mom didn't start attending church again after she divorced my stepdad. And a friend of mine invited me to his church, had a good youth group. Sure. It's Christ Church in Federway, off of Pack Highway, and big church, 1,000 people. What I didn't realize at the time, and it took me a couple years, is it was fundamentalist in doctrine. Only men could be elders. And my mom would attend on occasion with me. But I think for both of us, what really we got tired of was the sermons were almost like clockwork every other week, where thank God we're saved and everybody else is going to hell because we're predestined and chosen by God. Calvinist to the tilt. And I still went to youth group there, but once I started driving and I had the ability to explore some other things, I actually started attending the Salvation Army again in Federway. And the interesting part of that is the officer, the minister who was there, was the same guy who had left with the church in Twin Falls with my dad.
Whoa.
He had come back after 4 or 5 years and was now in Federway. So I knew him. I mean, I had met him. And when I was looking for something different, I settled in there for about a year before I went off to college. So it was an interesting full kind of circle.
Wow.
And I think in a lot of ways, if I didn't know him, I don't know that I even would have tried it. But at the time, I had seen all these different churches. At this point in time, in high school, my dad had left the cultish thing, was experimenting with Eastern Orthodoxy. So I'd go visit him in the summer. And for a couple weeks that I wasn't at the scout camp that I worked at, I'd go to an Eastern Orthodox service. And I'm like, this is interesting.
That's very different. Yeah.
It's these extremes. And, I knew I didn't want that, but I think in high school I had the first cognitive dissonance. So I was a self-professed conservative evangelical Christian who thought the church should do something about trying to help the world. Really weird theology at the time. So, I'd listen to Rush Limbaugh and then flip around and say, well, why is the church that I'm attending a bunch of white middle-class people? And that was high school for me. I think it started to change towards my senior year. I became less conservative. I graduated in 96. I do not remember if I voted. It was in that weird period where I think I was still registered in Seattle, but I was attending school in Colorado. So it was just a really weird time. That religion for me was of utmost importance. In high school, I had long talks with my youth pastor and the Salvation Army officer guy about my future. I felt a call to ministry. I knew I wanted to do something with it. The youth pastor at the fundamentalist church was like, well, go to Multnomah Bible College. It's the best school in the country, sitting down there in Portland. So I said, send me the information. I looked at it and I said, they're all Dallas theological educated. No.
Oh, yeah, so it's all the same. Like you were looking for some contrast.
Yeah, I was looking for an ecumenical school because I had been to enough churches, and I'm like, they all say they're right. And I've met good people in all of these, well, with the exception of my dad's cult. But for the most part, they're all good people. And so they can't all be right.
It's not so black and white.
Yeah, it isn't black and white. And I knew that if I was going to do this and be honest with myself, I needed to figure out what I believed, how I believed it. And to do that, I needed to gain knowledge and wisdom from people from across the Christian tradition. And I think what really formed that in some really weird ways is Scouts. So when I got involved in Boy Scouts in the 6th grade at John Knox, and I stayed there through high school. Involved in many ways. I got my Eagle Scout my senior year. Had a blast. For me, it was the only constant in my life that stayed with me throughout that period of time. And I look back on it, and the values and the skills and the leadership ability I developed in Scouts were probably the most formative thing that happened during that entire time.
Wow. That's really cool that you had that in your life, with all the tumultuous stuff going on.
Yeah. I was very fortunate that my mom supported that. And when I've talked to her about it, she said she recognized that I needed strong, good male influences in my life. And most definitely she's right. But when realizing that most of these kids and the parents that I'm talking with they didn't go to John Knox. Some of them did, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them didn't go to church at all. They were cultural Christians, which isn't unique in scouting. So most of Scouts has this belief in God, but a lot of times it's very cultural. And then I spent 3 years working at a Scout camp in Idaho, which it was culturally Mormon.
Oh, interesting.
The Scout movement in southern Idaho is very much controlled and influenced by the LDS Church.
Uh-huh.
There's a handful of non-LDS troops, and they all get along, but most of them are run by the LDS Church.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. It was their Chosen Boys program at the time. That's wavering a little bit right now with some of the things that the Scouting has done with LGBT issues and now going to bring girls in. So I think that might be wavering in some areas of support with the LDS.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, Scouting was that stabilizing influence throughout junior high and high school. And I realized that you didn't have to be dogmatic to be a good person. And in fact, I think subconsciously, I started to realize that the best people weren't the dogmatic people. The more dogmatic you were, in a lot of ways, my experience has taught me that the more dogmatic you are, the more sure that you are, more of a tendency to be an asshole. I know for me, when I was the most sure of something and I wanted to push it, that's when I can become an asshole. So I think a lot more grace and a lot more honest understanding that you don't have to have all the answers.
That's cool. That's interesting that you were kind of processing all that. That's a good insight to have, at that age, to kind of be noticing the people who were a little more empathetic and less dogmatic. They were the better people in general,
Totally. So as I was in high school, as I was facing these decisions about what to do, the family dynamic that was there is I was still in the middle. So starting in, well, pretty much the whole time my dad was in Idaho, I was the one planning all the trips. So the agreement was that my dad would figure out a way to get us to Idaho for the summer. That didn't always pan out.
So he was just a bad planner?
I don't know if it's bad planning or more trying to think how I would phrase this. My dad's a dreamer and doesn't necessarily always have the follow through, or he also will take a tidbit of truth and in his own mind exaggerate it out. So somebody might say, yeah, we might be able to do that, in a couple months. We might be able to drive over with you or whatever. And in his mind it's a done deal. I don't got to worry about it. Everything's finalized.
Oh, wow.
And then he starts scrambling a couple days before when they're like, what are you talking about? So, really so there was a lot of this that for me I had to start planning things. So there were times that we met halfway. I would get my stepdad to drive me to the Washington, Oregon border on 82, Pendleton, Oregon area. It's halfway, they'd come get us and we'd meet in the middle. There were times that my mom would just pay to fly us as she was doing better. Once I had a car, I was driving. So, for the last 2 years of life, I would drive back and forth. There was 1 year where I had a week off school and I was like, I want to take the train. At that time, the train was still running from Seattle to Salt Lake. Goes right through Twin Falls. And I was like, I'm going to take the train and everything's set. And then my sister decides about a month before to come with. And so we end up flying. I was like, I ain't going to do a train ride with my sister. Nope. So
That's so
we
funny.
flew, and then he met us in Boise. Because at that point, pre-internet, you're calling Alaska Airlines saying, how can you get me to Boise? And, so it's the puddle hoppers that go. We went from Seattle to Lewiston and Lewiston to Boise, and then Seattle, coming back Boise to Moscow Pullman, and then over to Seattle. So a lot of 19-seater planes, which I swore I'd never get on one again.
Yeah, those are
Then I moved
interesting.
to Alaska. So,
Oh.
but yeah, so I was getting ready to graduate high school. I finished up my Eagle Scout project. I knew I wanted to do something different. I was attending the Salvation Army as my church, and I started looking at colleges. Had to be a Christian school because I wanted to major in biblical studies or theology, but it needed to be a very ecumenical school. And I ended up settling on Colorado Christian University, which at the time met those requirements.
Hmm.
So this late 90s, it's a small Christian school. I had an aunt and uncle who were here in Denver that they told me about the school. I did have one requirement for any school. It had to be at least a day's drive from Seattle,
Hmm.
and not between Twin Falls and Seattle. So I didn't want to be in the middle anymore. This was a very intentional decision that I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be the one to, when I'm in college, to say, well, you guys got to figure out how to get my sister to my dad's or to my mom's or whatever. I wasn't going to do it. I was done. I needed out of that mess.
Yeah.
And that was the reason why I didn't look at other schools. I didn't look at staying in Seattle. I didn't look at a lot of other places to go. So I was looking at Azusa Pacific and Colorado Christian and a couple others, but cost-wise, and I had family here, I packed up in August of 96 and drove out to Denver.
Wow.
So.
And when you got to Colorado Christian, then did you know? Yeah, you said you wanted to get a degree in biblical studies or theology.
Yeah.
Did you know you wanted to be in the ministry at that point?
I believed I had a call to the ministry. I didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't know whether that meant the Salvation Army. I mean, I'd only been going there about a year, so it was still kind of newish. I'm like, maybe. And I'd only experienced one little congregation, one little church. And so, I got involved in a non-traditional Salvation Army church here in Denver. So we didn't wear the uniforms. They sang contemporary music, met in a strip mall, still did some of the stuff, still did the Christmas kettle, still did some social service type stuff, but it was really non-traditional church-wise. I tell people all the time, if I'd walked into one of the traditional churches and they were in uniforms and singing hymns with a brass band, I would have left.
That's funny. I don't know very much about the Salvation
Yeah.
Army Church. So what you're telling me is all very interesting and it's new.
Yeah,
so they wear uniforms, huh?
Yeah. So if you've ever watched the parades, the Rose Parade that the Salvation Army marches in every year, or other parades, you'll see a Salvation Army uniform. It's red in the parades, but typically it's a blue polyester suit. They have epaulets. It actually looks like, in many ways, an airline pilot's uniform, traditionally. If you're on a United flight or a Delta flight or something, or Alaska Airlines if you're smart. So it's this uniforms. It is a church that's built with a rank structure that's modeled after the Army.
That is so interesting. Just the combination of like
Yeah.
military and religion, which we know happens anyway in conservative circles, but yeah.
Yeah. So it is really interesting to do a deep dive into that. It started in 1865. It was out of the Methodist movement. It was the founders, William and Catherine Booth, were Methodist. He was a Methodist minister in England, and he stole the doctrines from the Methodist New Connection. And he had a belief that the whole goal of life was to get people saved, get them clean, get them sober, so they can go to heaven. But this idea that he was preaching in the slums and the East End of London, and when they came to America, even they would start in the inner city. there was this idea of social transformation at the same time that individual spiritual transformation. And so there was a belief that it went hand to hand. Over time, over about a decade, this structure developed, and he adopted a military nomenclature and the rank structure and everything. But really all it was taking military terms and applying them to terms the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church already used. So the bishops became divisional commanders, and instead of calling them a bishop, they were called a colonel.
That is so
different ranks.
Peculiar.
Oh, it's the most interesting thing, and I can't compare it. And I've done a lot of comparative, religions. I can't compare it to anything in Christianity. From a financial perspective today, the Salvation Army, at least in the Western world, U.S., Europe, Australia, the Western English-speaking world, which is the oldest parts of the Salvation Army. Sidebar: he believed in expansion of the Salvation Army using the tool that God had ordained, which was the British Empire. So the Salvation Army actually expanded anywhere the British flag flew. He would send an officer and some money and go start the Salvation Army wherever. So South Africa, India, Australia, and Canada, all before the U.S. There were actually some immigrants who brought it without his permission to the U.S. He stepped foot in the U.S. a couple times, begrudgingly. He was very upset that the U.S. would ignore God's will and leave the British Empire. So he was a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
And there's a couple good books out there on the history of the Salvation Army if people get interested. But in today's Western U.S., financially, 95% of the money comes from social services or fundraising ostensibly for those social services.
Oh, wow.
But it's that structure that allows them to function with churches. So you walk into a Salvation Army building, and most of the time you'll see, they'll have a food pantry and some employees that help that. But for that food pantry, they'll raise a few $100,000 a year in a community, sometimes a lot more if they have a shelter or something like that. And that allows the minister to also be a pastor and have a congregation. Most of them are small, 30, 40, 50, 60 people, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger. There are congregations that are larger. When you're talking few hundred is a big congregation for the Salvation Army in the U.S. The money they raise from the public offsets the ability to have churches. So, when people donate to a kettle outside the grocery store, they believe it's going to help somebody, low income, run a shelter, whatever. And while that happens in some places in rural America, most of the time in our big cities, it helps fund the church.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's not like you're giving to the homeless. You're essentially giving to pay the salary of the pastor or keep the lights on or something.
Yeah, you could argue it's helping the homeless because the Salvation Army being run by the ministers. That's the other thing is it identifies as a church, and so its board is internal of ministers. They will make sure the ministers in the church happens before social services. So if they have to cut a position, they're going to cut a social services position. But so the money does go to the church, but you could argue that maybe it helps in some way. I don't. I stopped supporting it when I left.
Yeah.
And I don't encourage people to support them as an organization anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, well, definitely for that reason, that's for sure.
Getting back to my story, I was in college, and I remember a trip with a bunch of us that were Bib Studies theology majors took with one of our professors. He's now a seminary president up in Canada. And we drove to Wheaton in Chicago for a Wheaton Theology Conference. And we had a really good conversation during that drive all around this what I would now call cognitive dissonance. I had these historical beliefs of what it meant to be a good person, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, anti-abortion, the whole religious right kind of agenda.
Yeah.
Juxtaposing with this very what I could now call a social gospel interpretation of the scriptures. There was this cognitive dissonance at the same time as I was studying a deep dive into philosophy, this understanding of how do we know what we know. And things started crumbling for me. And so I pretty quickly was able to flip the switch to really embracing a postmodernist philosophy, which the simplified version of that for me was an ethics that are derived from Aristotle, which is really about what you do, not necessarily what you believe. And things not as a foundation. So there's a Descartesian philosophy model that says you have this foundation. For Descartes, it was he thinks, therefore I am, and from that you can rebuild your foundation of knowledge. Mm-hmm. There was another philosopher, Thomas Quine, who argued that knowledge is actually more like a web. And so you have all these interconnective parts of what you know, and it allows you, as one thing changes, you can evolve and merge, and the closer to the center is the most deeply held belief. But over time, that might move out. So you may have a belief that's really deep to the core of who you are, but over time, it can become less important. And for me, that was huge to realize that as just like a web, a spider's web will evolve and change over time. Beliefs and how you determine and what you think is true has to evolve. And for me, that's exactly what happened over the next 20 years.
Wow.
Close to 20 years.
But it started in that car, in that conversation driving over to Wheaton.
Yeah, I was able to put together a lot of pieces. I was able to sit down and really talk through just how I couldn't have all these same beliefs in this same web. It had to change. Something had to give.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was being stretched to the limits. And basically what gave for me at the time was the belief that I was right.
Yeah, that you just what you believed, the way you were raised, that's the right way.
Right. And it's more than that. It's also part of postmodernity would argue that there is not an absolute truth. So growing up, I was taught that there was absolute truth. It was God and the Bible, and God said it, you did it. Mm-hmm. And what happened really was a change in that to where there isn't absolute truth. At the time, I might say we couldn't know it, even if there was. For a long time, that's kind of where I sat is, yes, God, maybe, but we can't know it. So the religious part of that is, it starts out with the Pentecostals and the Presbyterians, they have the same valid claims to truth. You can't distinguish the truth of one or the other. It's impossible. Because truth only makes sense in the context in which it is. So, the Pentecostals can claim if you're going to be saved, which really means a part of our club, then you have to speak in tongues. Fair enough. The Presbyterians would say, if you speak in tongues and believe in miracles, you're nuts. You can't be part of our club. For both of them, that's true. And so it led me down this path of being very open to, okay, well, whatever works for you. And so for me, it became much more about ethics and how we treat people and what we do. And so ministry, and we were active. I was active in for lack of a better word, parish ministry for a decade, in one way or the other. And for me, that was the driving force of it's how you treat people. It's what you do. It is very much, was very focused on day in, day out action. And a lot of stuff started falling by the wayside. So after I finished college in 2000, I spent a year working for the Salvation Army in Grand Junction, Colorado, and then went to their seminary. They have a 2-year officer training program, which they called college. I called indoctrination. It was really the first time that I wore a uniform every day. I hate ties to this day. When I quit, I threw them all away. I still have a Seahawks tie, though. I just don't. So I went to this college for 2 years. It's in California. There were really good parts of it, the fellowship and the people you meet and the relationships that I still have to this day with some of my professors. The people they're teaching the courses were Salvation Army officers. And I met my wife there. So there's some really good stuff that came out of that. I thought the classes were stupid. They were at an AA level, and I was looking at, okay, I've been through all this before.
Yeah, it was just like real basic stuff, huh?
Yeah, a lot of redundancy. So I had some fun. I was able to take some advanced courses, but I'm a year out of a pretty rigorous theology program. You're going to, New Testament 101, and, Paul wrote these books.
Like,
no, he didn't.
Goodness. Yeah.
He wrote some of them. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. And, even then, I still believed, the standard, mostly evangelical line of, some of them were written by Paul.
Yeah.
Maybe is my answer now. It was a good 2-year program, met a lot of people. My wife and I started dating in my second year. So really the second year of that was focused on figuring out how to date my wife and eventually get married within about 10 months. Then I was commissioned. She was a year behind me. I was ordained. And we spent the next 5 years trying to figure it all out, what this job was. A couple of years of that were spent in Redondo Beach. I discovered there that my real skill set wasn't in church stuff. If you'd asked me, even when I was getting ready to go into the program, I would have said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to evangelize and I'm going to get kids saved. I want to work with teenagers and all that. And I was sent to a place we had a independent senior living program, and Meals on Wheels. So everything we did was about seniors. And we were in the hole financially, and they threw me the budget and said, fix it.
Oh.
And my training wasn't at the time in any kind of financial management. I looked at the budget and understood it implicitly, and discovered over the next few years that that's really where my skill set lied. We're in leadership, budgeting, financial planning, financial management of organizations.
Oh, cool.
Decided fairly quickly to go back to school and get a master's degree. And then for 3 years, we spent as chaplains and on the senior management team of a 300-bed drug and alcohol treatment center on Skid Row in LA. It was interesting because we were the chaplains, so we did Sunday services. I did Bible studies. At times, if we were short-staffed, I'd take a caseload. My wife was doing very similar stuff with the women's side. And a lot of it was also organizing something that I believed was recreation. My minor was in outdoor leadership. And this idea of doing things together, whether it's in the outdoors or whether it's sitting up in the rec hall because you can't do something outside on Skid Row. We would organize pinochle tournaments, and the hardest day that I ever spent there was the Super Bowl in 2006. Watching the refs give it away.
Oh, no.
with when they scored a touchdown and they were short. That was the Seahawks and
Steelers.
Yes, that team. That was the hardest day there. I still think the throw at the end zone later was worse.
There were so many bad calls.
I know.
So it was brutal.
I remember one guy in particular though that changed my outlook on life. And he'd been struggling in the program for a while. I think he had been his second or third time in treatment. He came to me and said, I'm really struggling, and here's why. And he came out to me that he was gay. And I was pretty liberal at that time. I mean, you know, I was really liberal. Still in the evangelical world, but probably one of the most liberal people I knew. And I was like, okay. And we had
That's funny.
staff who was LGBT.
Really?
It was
because it wasn't a Salvation Army program, right?
Yeah. Well, it was a Salvation Army program, but the social services in the church have a pretty strong line there. And we were in the social services realm. So, you know, you take government funds, you can't discriminate. And so it was Salvation Army, but it was not recognizable as a traditional Salvation Army church. Our congregation was primarily African American because they made up the majority of our folks in treatment.
Oh, wow.
My wife, who's African American, we're an interracial couple, so it was a good fit. We had a gospel choir from people who were in the program, a lot of different things. And this kid, who I call him a kid, he was probably older than me at the time. You know, he was just really struggling with his identity and guilt that he felt.
Yeah.
So I actually ended up letting him do a mural in our chapel that he felt was symbolism of his journey. So I worked with him quite a bit. And I don't know if he was ever successful. He really struggled for quite a while. This idea of hope and this idea that hell was right outside. You know,
Yeah.
there were streets that we wouldn't walk down. I was never afraid walking on Skid Row. And part of that was I wore my uniform. They knew what it was, you know, on the backs of people who'd been there long before. It was the same center that my grandfather had gotten saved at and worked at for 20 years. So there was this real sense of there was hope. But I realized that the hope had nothing to do with the Bible.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.